Welcome back to Medieval Art. I'm Dr. Brian Keene, and I'm joined again with my friend and colleague, Dr. Larissa Grolleman. Larissa, we're seeing a wider, expanding world of Westeros and Essos this week. We've seen some interesting action and drama, so let's get started with a few things that stood out as real highlights this week.
Yeah, so this week, I think we got an interesting glimpse with the time jump about what has been happening over the past 3 years with the war and the Stepstones and the birth of Aegon, Rhaenyra's half brother, and a lot of issues with the question of succession and power. So I think for you, who is a character that you felt like really stood out or was particularly interesting this week?
Well, in a way, I was excited to see, as we talked about even before recording, the development of the relationship between Rhaenyra and Viserys and Rhaenyra and Alicent. I mean, that triangle of relationships is going to be interesting to watch and to see as they continue to develop, especially with the future aging up that we expect with the casting choices that have been made. But I think the character that I was most excited to see, but then immediately disappointed because we didn't get more development, was Laenor Velaryon. Of course, we saw him ride in on this great dragon, Sea Smoke. So I'm here for dragons. I'm here for new characters, but this is one character that they can do a lot more with, and I'm holding out hope that we get to see a lot more with his many relationships and his many loves. Without spoiling for future episodes, I'm hopeful for what they'll do with this character. But what about for you? Who stood out this week, either for good or for worse?
I'm coming around a little bit to Allison Hightower. I thought she showed a lot of kind of grit, a slightly more determination than we've seen from her. Her father Otto, of course, asks her to talk to the king about naming Aegon as the official heir, and she immediately goes to Viserys, and instead of doing that, kind of talks about how to strengthen Rhaenyra's position as the successor and heir to the crown. So I think she is getting a little bit more interesting, a little bit more she has a little bit more agency in terms of her position as queen. And we saw her kind of talking to the ladies at court on the hunt. And she's having a little bit more of an interesting narrative in terms of what she's able to do and who she's talking to and about what.
I agree. And I think that is a relationship and a character dynamic we'll continue to see expand. I have to say, on the flip side of things that maybe weren't working, is anytime a show teases out a character and suggests a greater conflict, and then we see that conflict so quickly resolved, I'm a little disappointed. So I think the Stepstone situation was played up a lot over these first 3 episodes, and it takes place over the course of just a few pages in the book. And I get that they're trying to up the stakes, that it's not just about Targaryen succession and the relationships at court, but these other worries in distant realms, this idea of the triarchy. And yet at the end of the day, I was a little disappointed in the way that played out. The battle looked epic, and we can say more about that later, but how are you feeling about the greater world building and these sort of conflicts elsewhere?
I agree. I was really disappointed in the resolution of the crab feeder narrative because we finally got a good look at him, and he seemed like such an interesting person, an interesting character. But I don't think we got anything in terms of the stakes of the war and really what his goal was and what he was motivated by. And I think we're just kind of missing a little bit of narrative drama with the Stepstones because we got the kind of involvement of Corlys and the kind of desperation of a war that should have taken not very long, but was actually stretching out into a much longer time frame than they had intended. But I was sort of disappointed to see that the crab feeder so easily dispatched after being built up for several episodes. So yeah, I'm sort of feeling a little bit disappointed, but I'm hoping that we get more glimpses of the free cities and kind of what's happening through the trading channels and things that Corlys keeps alluding to.
One of the things I know we were excited about in our last episode is moving beyond King's Landing and trying to see this bigger world. So aside from these stepstones, we did step just outside into the King's Wood, and we're reminded of that great hunting ground from Game of Thrones early days. We saw a boar running through the woods and got this epic scene with Rhaenyra. But you're a scholar who's worked on court culture and the development of courts. I think of the Field of Cloth of Gold from the 1520s as this really elaborate display of court culture between Henry VIII of England and Francis I. But tell me how that entire name day celebration sat with you in the royal hunt.
Yeah, I was actually really interested to see the kind of visual apparatus behind this royal hunt, because it is a really exciting thing, I think, for me as a scholar of the kind of visual culture around these court events and the kind of power that they're meant to convey. So the idea that you would have this extremely elaborate kind of hunt setup where there are a ton of tents and there's musicians and art, and all of the court elite come in their sort of best finery, and they come to talk to each other and gossip, and all of these different things happen. It's a place for display and a place for maneuvering politically. And so I was really interested to see the kind of elaborate kind of visual setup for the hunt. And then, of course, the idea that the hart or the stag would be captured for the king to kill, also extremely medieval in terms of its kind of practice. The idea of the hunt as a place for the display of imperial power, for the display of royal power, I thought was really interesting. And of course, we saw the white hart, which is a medieval symbol of all sorts of things, but purity, loyalty, royalty, all of these things. So I thought that was really interesting in terms of maybe a little too on the nose symbolism when it appears to Rhaenyra. But I was really interested to see that kind of involved in the fabric of the show.
And it is one of these symbols that would be then immediately recognizable to both people in the Middle Ages and in this fantasy realm. And as you say, it's playing up on the idea of omens and ephemera. The other thing that I chuckled at is when we meet the Lannisters for the first time, Rhaenyra makes a comment that, yes, I recognized all the lions. And that idea of sigils and the house emblems is something that we think about and will continue to see. You see the seahorse floating away and you know immediately that we're thinking about the Valerian family. So those touches I felt were really appropriate. The idea of name days are really interesting to think about. If you lived in the Middle Ages, you would celebrate not necessarily your birthday, but the name of the saint or the martyr after whom you're named, which could in fact correspond with your birth date. But for me, being born in April, there's no St. Brian, but I would have celebrated Charlemagne's feast day in January, for example. So those touches were nice. I think they leave us wishing for more in episodes to come. If we return to the idea of the crab feeder and the Battle of the Stepstones and this idea of Daemon as this sole warrior, were there aspects of that conflict or the resolution of it that stood out to you? Anything that leapt out as, yes, this is medieval, or, ugh, I'm kind of over it?
I mean, I thought the idea of a single man kind of taking on a whole army was very Game of Thrones in a way, as sort of echoes of Jon Snow a little bit. But yeah, I don't love Daemon as a character, and I'm also not sure what he's motivated by. Like, why is he so proud and to not accept help from Viserys and to sort of want to take over the whole war himself? Of course, he succeeds, I guess, but it felt a little too easy.
I agree. There was an aspect of his storyline arc that's not yet coming across. We don't clearly see the motives, I don't think, for really anyone in the show. We know that the throne is there, but are the stakes for the Iron Throne that great? I think to your point about the single male warrior, I mean, this is a trope from medieval literature. We read it in the Shahnameh with Rostam and Zal and a number of others. Arthurian legends are all about these male warriors who go off and perform great deeds. Or in Japanese samurai literature, we have Takezake Suneaga, which fights the entire Mongol horde. So this plays up some of the masculinist themes behind Game of Thrones. And I just hope that we'll get more really powerful, prominent female characters and the queer relationships that I'm hoping come through. So I guess in our final minute, is there something that will keep us watching the show for weeks to come? What would it be for you?
I think for me, I'm interested to see what happens with Rhaenyra. She has clearly been pouting for the last 3 years about maybe not being the heir, but we've reconfirmed that she is indeed the heir. Viserys says that he wavered for a minute, but that he's recommitted to her. So I'm interested to see how she develops as a character, if we get more time jumps, what those look like. And I'm interested to see her kind of come into her own as heir, hopefully fortified by the vision of the white hart that she saw on the hunt.
Agree. I'm looking forward to those. And I think a project that you're working on is the idea also of film locations that really inspire the Middle Ages. So that's something all of the viewers can look out for on the Getty social media channel. Larissa, it's always fun talking with you. Thank you again. And we'll see you next week to discuss episode 4. Ciao.